Mr. Owen.
My Lady, may I please call Baroness Anne Longfield?
I do solemnly,
I do solemnly,
sincerely and truly declare and affirm
sincerely and truly declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence that I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much for coming back to help us, Lady Longfield. We can continue the discussion we started some months ago.
Thank you.
May I please ask that you give your full name to the inquiry?
Anne Elizabeth Longfield.
And I think that you ought to have a witness statement in front of you with the number INQ 000588139.
I do.
And can you confirm, please, that that statement is true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes, it is true.
I'm grateful. I think it's correct that you held the role of Children's Commissioner for England from March 2015 until February 2021, is that right?
That's right.
And thereafter you became the founder and the executive chair of the Centre for Young Lives.
That's right. It was founded last year, at the beginning of last year.
And could you explain or just summarise what the work of the centre is, please?
It's a think tank and delivery unit. It is established to focus on children and young people entirely. It's to look at the needs and outcomes of all children, but especially we take an interest in disadvantaged children and vulnerable children. There's much in the work that I undertook as Children's Commissioner that I continue in this role. It's a new organisation, it's a charity, and it has a small team.
And does that mean then that you're also able, in the course of your evidence, to provide evidence about ongoing impacts to children that link back to the pandemic?
That's right. It has a number of programmes that it's taken over the last year and a half, which highlight the state of the nation, if you like, of our children. Most in particular, a piece of work that looked at statistics around vulnerability and was published in July. And that relates directly in comparison to the statistics around vulnerability just before COVID.
Well, perhaps we'll come to that at the end of your evidence, if I may. But I wanted really to go back to the start and to ask you about the statutory functions of the Children's Commissioner first. I think it's right that the primary function of the Children's Commissioner for England is to promote children's rights. Is that correct?
It is. It is.
And is it also the statutory function of the Children's Commissioner, and this is under Section 2.3 of the Children Act 2004, in the discharge of that function to provide advice to persons who are exercising functions in relation to children? That's
right. It works under the framework of the United Nations Convention of the Rights of the Child, the international treaty. I was the Children's Commissioner of England. There are also Children's Commissioners for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, and I think you've had some evidence submissions from them. It also has lead responsibility on non-devolved issues such as immigration and youth justice. But essentially you are the eyes and ears of children within the sphere of decision making. Your role is to understand children's lives and listen and consult with children, but then reflect not only their views but their best interests to those that are making decisions. It's independent of government. I was answerable not to a department, I was answerable to the Education Committee, i.e. Parliament. And as part of your role within UNCRC, that you submit evidence for their periodic reviews every 5 years.
And just going back to the statutory language, the Act provided that the Children's Commissioner may, in particular, advise the Secretary of State on the rights, views and interests of children. Is that correct?
That's right. And within that range of children and their rights, there were particularly responsibles about vulnerable children and particularly children in care as well.
So I think that what that means, looking at the statutory scheme, was that in effect you were charged with the provision of advice to the Secretary of State amongst your other functions.
Yes, amongst others. It would also include local authorities. It would also include those who are heading up health agencies. But all of those that had decision-making powers over things that affected children's lives. It was a small team. The budget at that time was about £2.5 million, which meant you've got about 25 people. And it's an arm's length body for Parliament, so sits within that kind of remit.
And just moving away from the statutory scheme and looking toward the Secretary of State, how did that work in practice prior to the pandemic? How would your advice be elicited?
Well, there would be an element of regularity around some meetings. Now, that might be every 6 months with different. There were quite a few secretaries of states over this period of time, but and so that would differ. But it may be a meeting every 6 months. It may be a meeting every 3 months, or even annually. The Children's Commissioner, it's down to them how they deliver on their responsibilities. So there is a work programme that is initiated by the Children's Commissioner, and that, for me, focused on vulnerable children and young people. We had a small research team. There was a really important statutory power that the Commissioner has, which is to be able to gather evidence and gather data. That means that they have an ability to be able to ask any public body for data, administered data, not on individual children, and expect that they would provide it unless there was a particularly good reason for it. And that is quite a significant power. It's something that even, government departments don't have of other departments. So that enabled me to be able to gather information on the kind of issues that children and young people were telling me were affecting their lives. I could then, such as mental health, for instance, lots of young people told me they were struggling to get help, struggling with waiting lists and the like. I was then able to undertake a piece of research which would ask and gather data from those that were meant to be providing those services, and then analyse that and present that in a report which highlighted actually what was going on and give recommendations of what needed to change. And over that period of time, in any 1 year, there would be probably about 10 different aspects of research going on that were reported on. A key piece of work which follows through in terms of all of my statement is a piece of work which we at the time called a vulnerability index. It looked to establish what vulnerability meant.
I'm so sorry to interrupt you. I'm going to move on to that. I just wanted to stick, if I might, on this narrow issue of your functions, because I really just wanted to get to the point. Your statutory role foresees that you will provide advice to the Secretary of State. Does that equally require that the Secretary of State comes to you to say, government is considering doing this, or we have a piece of legislation in the pipeline? What's the advice of the Children's Commissioner?
Well, you would hope that that would be the case, and certainly when there's been the context where you have a Secretary of State which is very interested in children's issues and wants to make that happen, I think that is much more the case, and you can see it in other countries. It's not a requirement. There is within the statute, it does say that you should consult, but it leaves it open over to what level that you would do that. And certainly I was never formally consulted as such, even though I might have been asked my opinion on something. Largely that came very late in the day, and it was informing rather than consulting.
All right. And are you there reflecting on the general practice prior to the pandemic?
Yes.
Because I think you said paragraph 24 of your statement that there was no, I think, settled practice of government coming to the office of the Children's Commissioner to consult.
No, that's right. And it was a relatively new role. I was the third Children's Commissioner. I was the first one with those statutory powers to gather data that you discussed. So it's an emerging role. And I think it's fair to say that it hadn't established itself within the decision-making powers within Westminster at that stage, or indeed the decision framework within Westminster hadn't yet adequately involved the Children's Commissioner, in my mind.
So I think it follows from all of that there was no, for example, threshold test that government applied in order to decide, yes, this is something that we should ask the Children's Commissioner about before we decide to do it, for example.
No, that precedent wasn't there.
And I'm going to come on to some specifics, but in general and in summary terms, did the position improve over the course of the pandemic? In other words, was the Children's Commissioner more closely integrated in decision-making in government in respect of children?
I think there was lots more contact during the pandemic because obviously there were a lot of decisions being made, often at high speed. I would often be telephoned the night before there was an announcement, such as the closure of schools, to let me know it was happening. You know, that was courtesy, I think, as much as anything, which, you know, I was grateful for. So the meetings were much more regular at all levels. I would meet officials formally once a fortnight. I would meet with the Minister for Children every month, probably every 6 weeks, I think, the Secretary of State. So there was more contact. I don't think that led to responding to the advice that I was giving. I think the situation was very fluid and somewhat chaotic. And it wasn't easy to see, well, it was very difficult to see where decisions were being made, and they certainly didn't seem to be made primarily by those people that were talking to me.
And again, I'm just putting this at a high level rather than looking at specifics, which we'll come to. But was there a practice of telling you, and I mean government telling you, this is what we're thinking of doing? What do you think during the pandemic? Or did the position remain that they told you what was going to happen as a matter of courtesy or as a matter of...
Yeah, there were occasions where that discussion about this is what we're thinking we might do, where that was put to me. But I don't think that the conversation we had when concerns were raised led to a change in the pattern or the decision.
All right. Maybe we'll turn to some of those specifics and just examine what in fact happened. I want to ask you, though, I'm going to move on to some specific pandemic-related issues. Did you consider that your statutory powers were adequate in the face of the pandemic? In other words, these new powers that you had been provided with to gather information, were they sufficient, or were there any powers that you consider the Children's Commissioner lacked?
Well, they were very good for gathering data, also very good for having the right of access to young people who were living away from home. So if there was an occasion either before or during the pandemic where a child may have been in some kind of secure accommodation, for instance, there was one occasion where a young girl was in a secure mental health unit. She'd been there for a long time. I was able to visit and gain access without asking and find out what was going on and intervene in that way. So those two were really important powers. There was also a requirement for government to respond to me, which again was useful, although if you can imagine during the pandemic, some of those responses took longer than others. What there wasn't, of course, was a requirement to respond positively to that advice. Nor there was any way to upscale that advice or those concerns. So in those ways, we took it upon ourselves to deliver on 30 different reports during that period of time on a whole range of issues, wrote lots of letters to Secretaries of State, put forward lots of solutions, because ultimately this was about moving things on to the best interests of children. But the machinery of government wasn't set up in decision making in a way that really responded to many of those. There were some examples of a positive response, either before or during COVID, before having raised really serious concerns about children's mental health and numbers of children, and being able to evidence that then with the data to back that up. There was a serious engagement, took a little time, but there was a serious engagement from government on that and from NHSE, and that in part led to the development of mental health teams in schools. So there were things, online safety was another. During the pandemic, there were some interventions that you could clearly see had made a difference. There was, I raised concerns about the potential to detain children under the public health safety without adults seeing it. That was quickly responded to. There are others where, it was really quite dismissed, the exemption of children under 12 for rule of 6, if you like. Okay. That was a quick exemption. We'll come to that.
I'll come to that. I just want to move on then, if I may, to the Children's Commissioner's estimates of vulnerability, which I think were periodically carried out prior to the pandemic. Is that right?
Yes, pre and during and post.
Yes, and I think perhaps if I can just bring up on screen, please, INQ 000-62176. Thank you. And this is an example, I think, of one of those estimates. I wanted to ask you some questions about this.
Yeah.
This is a breakdown of the Children's Commissioner estimate of the number of children who are vulnerable in England, correct?
Yes.
And it's not just based on the number of children who were on who had a child protection plan or
No.
who had reached the threshold of being a child in need. Is that right?
Yes, this was actually one aspect of those sets of data, but this actually, for the first time, this was the second year actually, had calculated the best estimate possible about those children who are living in vulnerable households. That was a figure that hadn't been calculated until we did it, and we found that 2.3 million children were living within vulnerable households.
And the question I just wanted to ask for this purpose is, how did your office estimate vulnerability? What did living in a vulnerable household actually mean?
So this looked at the numbers of children who were living in households where there was severe mental health, parents had severe mental health, addiction, or there was domestic abuse. And the figure was so high, actually, we had a serious discussion about whether it was too high to be believed, because it's around 1 in 6 children. We're very aware that a lot of this was hidden. But it was the figure, and we thought it was very important to say that. We estimated from that 2.3 million that actually 1.6 million families were getting little or no help. We looked at the response, the kind of support these families were getting, and we estimated that 1.6 million were getting very little help. They were almost invisible. So for us, as we entered the pandemic period, we felt that this group of children who would be at home with their families in very, very vulnerable situations, this is even before you start to look at the impact of poverty and housing and the like, had particular, there were particularly concerns about their well-being and very likely heightened vulnerabilities as a result of lockdowns.
Thank you. And I think within this group, I think that you estimated that 829,000 children were invisible. So I think it's probably important to make that distinction, that those were children with no form of statutory intervention in their lives. That's right. Is that correct?
Yes.
And then the remainder were either those children who had statutory interventions or it was unclear what level of support they were getting. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right, them and their families. And there were 800,000 children live in households with domestic abuse. Now, domestic abuse is the biggest driver of children being taken into care. So this is, a lot of families, children who were living in quite perilous situations sometimes.
All right. I'm going to move on then. That was the situation. Thank you. That can come down. That was the situation in 2019. I just want to turn to the period, please, that the pandemic was unfolding. So from January to mid-March. In that period, did the government approach you at all about the possible implications of a pandemic for children generally?
Well, there would be some discussions that would take place as part of kind of regular meetings, but in no formal way was I involved in planning for the pandemic in terms of children. I think in the run-up to schools being locked down, it was quite chaotic. It wasn't clear who had responsibility for planning for children, if anyone, nor what options were being considered, nor, if any, assessments were made about potential impact on children.
Can I just, if I ask you just to halt there and let me just take this in a methodical way, but were you consulted or were there discussions with you about the possible implications of school closures for children prior to that announcement being made?
No, although I did obviously send a lot of correspondence and briefings and raise concerns myself.
Was that prior to the 18th of March or was that after the announcement was made?
I think there was some... So I think there was largely during that later March period, probably some between the middle of March and the actual lockdown starting.
And were there any discussions with you or consultation with you about the implications of a lockdown on children prior to the lockdown being announced?
No.
Had there been any discussions or consultations with you about how children's social care could be maintained in the context of a pandemic?
No, not at that time.
Or a lockdown? Was there any discussion with you about or consultation with you about how possible school closures could be mitigated if that eventuality arose?
No. I'm not sure there were any of those discussions taking place.
If you
That's not to say they shouldn't have been, nor that I would have hoped they would have discussed them with me, but I do have to say I'm not even sure they were, those discussions.
If you had been involved or if there had been that sort of consultation or discussion, are there clear points that you would have wanted to have made, I don't know, in February 2020 about the sort of groundwork that might need to be done prior to school closures or a lockdown?
Well, the first one would, of course, been about vulnerable children and safeguarding those vulnerable children in whatever context was chosen. Having vulnerable children being able to go to school was very important, and of course, not wanting to jump ahead, but that was agreed, and I was very pleased and relieved about that. But also, I would have raised concerns and did through letters later in that month around families who were living in temporary accommodation. A significant number of families were at risk of homelessness. I think 375,000 families were. Some families were sofa surfing at the time. Those families where there was domestic abuse at home. Those families where they were struggling financially and may struggle with, being able to balance the responsibilities between their children and working. Those families who lived in very cramped conditions at home and had no access to gardens, about 8% of children don't have access to a garden. So the pressures that you could see that families were facing before COVID, those that had mental health at home and those children with poor mental health were all things that, in my view, should have been ringing alarm bells, which meant that there should have been, a very serious consideration of balancing those social needs and economic needs against the need for lockdown.
And do you think that there were practical things that might have been done in advance of those considerations as well? For example, the identification of those children within schools, those sorts of steps.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I published those figures around vulnerable children living in vulnerable families for a reason. That was to inform decision making so that they could be identified, so that they could be supported, and so they could be a priority for that support. So that certainly was a disappointment that at that point, having published those figures for 2 years, that there wasn't a greater response in terms of government priority. But broader than that, there were issues around the number of children and families who didn't have access to either technology or the internet. Over 1 million children didn't have access to tech. About the resilience of schools to be able to provide that technical support. We know that an awful lot of private schools were able to continue with lessons online, whereas state schools just didn't have the tech or the capability or the resources and skills to be able to do that. In other countries, they considered things like taking over other public buildings next to schools to be able to operate across, a broader footfall, which would have meant more social distancing. And of course, then there's issues around how you protect children and staff against infection. And of course, when it got to vaccination stage, that was another area where I felt there should be a priority. So within all of that, there could have been, or there should have been, huge amounts of planning and prep about how we delivered this life-changing lockdown, if you like, where suddenly 10 million children didn't go to school anymore, and what that meant.
All right, I think we'll examine what that meant. Just to go back to slightly drier issue of decision making and where children's rights fit in. I know you contacted SAGE, and we'll come to that, about your concerns about how decisions were being made, but I think it's correct that in the run-up to the decision to close schools, you weren't, for example, an observer to SAGE. You didn't have access to the sorts of advice that was being provided.
No, I had no formal role in any of that.
And do you think it would have been useful had you been made aware of the sorts of advice that was being given in order that you could fulfil your statutory functions?
Essentially, because I would then have been the voice of the child in that room, whereas my feeling throughout this, a theme throughout, is that children weren't represented in decision making.
Yes, and we'll come to where that voice might fit when we come to look at the correspondence with SAGE. Moving on then, if I may, you've touched upon your concerns about where school closures and lockdown would leave vulnerable children, and we'll come to the policy that the government arrived at the start of that period. But at the time when the government announced that they were going to enable certain categories of children to attend school, were you satisfied with that approach? And I mean at the time rather than with the benefit of hindsight. Or did you think immediately there are problems with this?
I was very relieved that the decision had been made to open up schools for vulnerable children. And I thought it was the right decision, and I said so to ministers, yeah.
And then if we look, please, at the detail of the policy, this is at tab 11, please, and it's document INQ 000520192. If we could just look at some of the detail of this, please. So I think this was the broad criteria that was applied. And we can see, first of all, that those children who had a social worker or child protection plan or who were looked after, yes?
Yes,
Who were a
that's
child
right.
in need. And those children who had an education, health and care plan as well, yes?
Yeah.
Can I just focus on that for a moment? The criterion that was applied in respect of them appeared to be, if we read down, that there should be an assessment as to whether their needs could safely be met at home. Is that correct?
That's right. There was a requirement for an assessment.
And if we go over the page to page 2, and I think the second paragraph is the paragraph that provided a discretion to schools and local authorities as well. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
I'm going to come back when we've looked at some parts of this to ask you some general questions about it. And if we go over the page, please, to page 3. We see under 3, it states that school is known as a protective factor for children receiving the support of a social worker, correct?
Yes.
And then under 4, it says that education is an important protective factor as well.
Yeah.
Did you understand the purpose of this policy then to be twofold? That in respect of children who were supported by social care, that it was intended to be a policy of child protection and to enable them to maintain their education as well?
Yes, that's right. There were the two aspects. These were children who were most likely to be, we knew there's a disadvantage gap between disadvantaged children and their more affluent peers in terms of education. These are the children who are most likely to be behind in their learning outcomes in that way. We also knew that they would benefit from that continued education. We know that time out of school, even during school holidays, accounts for much of that disadvantage gap, about 2/3 actually. So we know that time out of education for some disadvantaged children has a huge impact. There was even the benefit potentially of having more one-to-one time with teachers and being able to get some boost to their education within school. But the other side is, yes, of course, school is a protective factor. There's important oversight from other professionals. It's for some children who may be living in difficult situations at home, then school is a place where they'll be able to potentially have, a different environment with more support. And we know that when it comes to referrals to social services, that the majority of referrals come from schools. So you lose that ability to be able to see what's going on, but also that ability to be able to respond. Again, going back to those children who were living in vulnerable households, the 1 in 6, that would have been a huge loss.
And I'm just going to move on. So if we look at page 6, please. And 13, do vulnerable children have to go to school? It set out, didn't there, that there would be an expectation that they would. Yes, as long as it was safe for them to do so.
Yeah.
And
So
this-
the expectation was clearly there. My concern that there wasn't enough action to follow up to ensure that happened.
All right, so I think we'll come to this,
Yeah.
but in theory,
In theory, the expectation was there, yeah.
yes. And if we skip ahead, please, to page 9. And this is the provision that was made for children with education, health and care plans. And I think we see in the first paragraph that there should be a risk assessment for each child. Is that correct?
That's right.
And that risk assessment would take into account health risks to that child. That's the first bullet point.
Yeah.
The risk to the child if some or all elements of their plan couldn't be delivered.
Yeah,
And then the ability of parents to care for them as well.
yeah,
And then an overall well-being consideration as well, correct?
that's right.
And then it's set out the expectation as to the categories of children that this would broadly apply to, yes?
Yes,
And I think the first one is children and young people who would be at significant risk if their placement did not continue.
Yes,
But that these were children who could not be safely supported at home, correct?
yes.
So did you read that as, in a way, providing two different thresholds that needed to be met, that a child had to go through the risk assessment process, and then the test was whether or not they could be safely supported at home?
Yes, there were several hoops, quite difficult hoops, that children would have to jump through to be able to get through this assessment.
And do you read that, the test being those who could not be safely supported at home, that was the test rather than whether or not children could safely come to school?
Well, I think clearly there would be huge concern if they couldn't be safely supported at home.
Yes.
My concern would be that there weren't adequate arrangements put in place to ensure that alternative support could be offered and that
Yes.
they were able to attend in school.
And I think we'll come to that when we see your concerns
Yeah.
about the requirements for health and care plans
Yeah.
being diminished. And then I think if we go over the page again, we can see that the other category of children was children and young people whose needs can be met at home, namely those who are not receiving personal care from their education setting.
Yeah.
So, looking at that policy, did it appear to, in essence, was it providing that it was those children who had the highest of needs, in terms of those children needing personal care, who were anticipated to be at school?
Yes, I think the implication from this is that children and young people's needs can be met at home will be of a lower priority to be able to attend school. Again, the word expectation is quite a loose word, and there does seem to be a kind of vague aspiration this might happen, but as we'll come on to, my concern was that the action wasn't put in place to ensure it happened.
So as regards those children, and these are children who have a plan, so they do have a higher level of need than other children with special educational needs. Nonetheless, this policy appeared to suggest that if they were sufficiently well or robust enough to come to school, they were in fact the children who should be at home. Is that correct?
Yes. I think that's what this leads to. The other part of this, though, with the assessment is if additional resources, including staffing resources, are required to attend school, which children with higher needs are likely to have, then the last piece here, where a local authority is enabled to put in place stated provision, they will need to use their reasonable endeavours. Clearly, there were potential shortages of staff, which would mean that wouldn't be possible either. So, it wasn't a straight line by just saying an expectation here, by any means.
Thank you. And if we just move on, please, I think we can touch on this very briefly. It's INQ 000 519 887. And this is a later piece of guidance. And if we just go to page 3 of that, I think we can see that remained the position that children, if we just look, it's the second bullet, that it remained essentially the criteria that children with an education, health and care plan whose needs couldn't be met safely at home were the children who could attend school. Is that correct?
Yep.
And again, if we could just go to page 4 of this as well. And if we just look, please, at the second paragraph, expectations on attendance. And again, that reiterates that advice. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. So risk assessment was, a key aspect of these children being able to or not able to attend school.
And I think, thank you, that can come down. And can I just say, to be clear, sorry, I've just realised I skipped over it, but that was later guidance then, that was from the 19th of April 2020, so that it remained the position. We'll come to this, but I think your office eventually saw that children were not, in fact, or there was inconsistency in children being offered risk assessments in order to be able to attend school in the first place.
That's right.
Is that
Many
right?
parents said that they weren't able to access an assessment.
Thank you. Just then looking at that guidance, it didn't explicitly refer to those children who had special educational needs as being entitled to attend school. Was that something which caused you concern?
It was, because the vast majority of children don't have an educational health plan of children with special educational needs. 75% don't have a plan. So those children would have needs and weren't being identified as being in need, and in my view should have been.
I think the answer to that might be that because the level of special educational needs is in fact so high amongst the population of England's children, I think the inquiry has heard that it was something like 1.3 million children, that number could never be catered for without imperiling the policy objective to try and limit infection rates. What would you say to that?
Well, two pieces of evidence from very positive practice that got larger numbers in. I mean, we'll go on to talk about how few did actually attend. So it actually, in practice, wasn't an issue as so few attended. But we looked in detail at nurseries that are operating within the NHS for workers. And we chose to look at that because they were operating and we wanted to see what their experience was. We found that in these nurseries, 50 to 80% were attending. And also in some schools that worked very hard to get parents, had a lot of disadvantaged children attending, worked very hard to get parents and children to be able to attend, and had much nearer to 80% attending. That was the Oasis Trust of Schools. They worked tirelessly to communicate with parents to get them to really get that confidence in being able to attend.
I think from your answer, I think what you may be saying is that you felt that as time wore on...
I don't think he was ambitious enough in being able to,
yes.
to see how many children both needed that support, but also how many a school could support safely.
I think it became... I think we can return to that and look at some of the specific things that you suggested. I think it quickly became apparent to you that children who were eligible to attend school under this guidance weren't doing so. Is that right?
That's right.
And is it at that point that you started to have concern about the guidance itself and whether or not it was excluding too many children, or was your concern about how the guidance was being implemented?
It was both of those things, and there were discretionary abilities to be able to support more disadvantaged children to attend. So the guidance could have been more embracing and should have been, in my view, but also how it was how it was handled, if you like. It wasn't a coherent message across government in terms of attendance. And this came just before there was the national lockdown communication, which told everyone they should stay at home and not leave their house. Now, in my view, that could have been handled slightly differently. It seemed to show that government hadn't understood the complexities of life for a lot of these children and families. And the message, of course, for all parents was that, don't leave home. It's unsafe to leave your home, which meant that those parents with vulnerable children who might have attended wondered why their children might take the risk to attend school when everyone else's wouldn't.
And that might appear to be a formidable barrier, how on the one hand you send out that message to the general population and how on the other hand you attract or you try and get families to send the most vulnerable children into school. What sort of messaging do you think might have overcome that barrier, or how could it have been made more attractive?
Well, let's remember as well, it was also children with key workers who were attending. So it was acknowledged in some of the documents that there wouldn't be stigma because key workers' children were attending. But I think that, language around children who were a priority would have been much more positive, so that actually attending school could have been seen as something which was sought after in many ways and a positive support for children and families, rather than something which was kind of labelled as vulnerability. And I think that was something that then showed through in terms of those that had contact with families, be they schools or social workers, having the confidence to be able to encourage them to attend school. There were very, very small numbers, less than 5% in the first few weeks. They grew into the, into 12, 15% eventually. It never got past 20% of vulnerable children attending school. So what started as a policy of very good intention, based on need, and a good decision, wasn't followed up in terms of how it's communicated or in terms of how children were and their families were supported to make the most of those places.
Messaging to whom? So if you're the government and you're going to try and persuade the entire population, nearly 70 million people, to stay at home, how do you get the messaging across? So you need a simple message. I've had this, as you know, in different contexts about how there weren't sufficient nuances in the messaging.
Yeah.
So are we talking about the government messaging to the public, or are we talking about messaging within the system? What are we talking about?
So I think first and foremost the public, because that's what everyone saw. They turned their TV on at 6 o'clock or whatever it was, and they got that message. And of course it had to be a stern and serious enough message that actually people did stay at home. But I think within that, there could have been some nuance around groups being able to access additional support, if you like, during this period. It could have been seen as an offer from government to help families, rather than something which was almost seen as, a punishment for those families. And then, of course, the messaging from the actual professionals around children's lives. I think it was such a strong message and everyone reacted with such fear that actually it was difficult for some of the professionals to be able to counteract that and say it'll be okay. It was only when you had a really good trusted relationship with those families in the first place, which some of those schools did, and obviously the NHS nurseries were absolutely needed to get people into work, that they was able to break through that. But I think understanding the complexities of how that would be heard, understanding the complexities of those parents' lives, there could have been a way to be able to show that this was an offer from government to help children who were a priority through this period.
Yes, so the key thing was, it seems, or an issue was the sort of the stigmatising. You can't. Yeah,
the blunt message, and then the lack of follow-up in terms of any explanation to those families. I mean, there were some areas, the practicalities of some, I'm not sure if we're on this by now, but the practicalities of some children being able to attend and others not, for some families, was difficult. For children in foster families, the child who was being fostered could attend, less so for the foster family's own children. In some local authorities where they realised this was the case, they just allowed all children in foster families to attend, and that was clearly their ability to do so. But that's a decision from someone who could see what was happening, who had the confidence to make it, and the confidence to follow through, and that wasn't always the case.
And did you come to any assessment as to why the messaging wasn't changing or becoming sufficiently strong to try and attract more vulnerable children into school during the first period of lockdowns? Well,
I think that first of all, the dilution of regulations, which we'll come on to, had already taken effect by then. So the level of contact with some families was less than it would have been. There would have been fewer staff, not as many as was anticipated would be absent, but still fewer. And I think at this stage there was a mix of either thinking, well, schools will open soon anyway. There was still that feeling in the first few weeks that maybe this would be till Easter, and maybe, I think you'll probably remember the conversations, maybe we'll have a long Easter holiday and everyone will come back after that. So there was still this feeling that actually it wouldn't last that long. But almost in a way that, you know, there's nothing we can do about it. Families have decided that they don't want to send their children in, and who are we to tell them that it's all right? So I think generally, you know, a lot of distrust in, well, not distrust, but a lack of clarity about what the science did actually say. Not great information to professionals. And there wasn't any kind of accountability framework from government to make sure that actually the professionals were doing their utmost to do that. It wasn't a direction from government that should happen. So those workers who were meeting with families were in many ways, the default was to support them to do the best for their kids during that period, at home, if you like, rather than point out and support them to see what benefits could have been gained by their children attending. Of course, there were some parents, a few, that would want that lack of scrutiny, would take that as a period where there was less oversight themselves and they could disappear from view.
Yes.
A huge minority, I'd like to say, with that, but there are instances, clearly.
So I think just two brief points then. Crystallising the duty as an expectation in the guidance. There's an expectation that children with a social worker would come to school. In your view, then, that wasn't sufficient to bring about change in the number of children who are attending?
No, there was no roadmap to enforcing or encouraging that expectation or supporting that expectation. And there was no, whilst people were generally encouraged, you can see from here, to support children to attend, there wasn't any route to be able to hold anyone accountable for that. There was data coming back which showed the areas where, you know, it showed data on attendance. So eventually you could see which authorities children were living and least likely to attend. But again, that wasn't something that was followed up in with the kind of rigour that I thought was necessary, because it was a huge opportunity to be able to support these children, a huge benefit, which would have had such an impact on those vulnerable children's lives during the pandemic. And it was an opportunity that was lost, in my view.
The children who were specifically mentioned in the criteria, obviously, broadly speaking, children with a social worker, and then there was a discretion left to schools and local authorities to deem children vulnerable. Did you think that was a sensible approach, i.e. to provide that local discretion?
I thought the discretion was important. However, I still would have thrown the net wider in terms of the children who were included in the first place, and children with special educational needs definitely, I thought, needed to be part of that group.
And in terms of oversight of the use of that discretion, and specifically government oversight of that discretion and how it was being used, did you think that there was adequate scrutiny of whether or not local authorities and schools were trying to get children within that broader category to come in?
Well, from what I could see from the action that was taken to remedy some of those very low attendance rates, even if the data was being collected and viewed, it didn't lead to a change in terms of the policy around children attending, i.e. It might have been known, but it didn't lead to any enhanced action from ministers or senior officials to support or require local authorities and others to support children into school.
And I think one of the things you point to in your statement was that, for example, there wasn't any sort of target for schools or local authorities in terms of the number of children that
it was
into
kind of
school.
I think it was an expectation that happened in words, it wasn't followed through with an informed plan of how it might be delivered, there wasn't an understanding of what a successful policy around attendance might look like. I think it's pretty obvious when it's less than 10%, that's not a terribly high level of success. I think we would know that. But nor was there any plan or process in place to really ensure that those numbers were boosted.
I know that you left your office in February 2021, but by the time you left, had you made any assessment as to why the numbers of vulnerable children who attended school in the second set of school closures was higher than had been in the first?
Can you just repeat that?
Yes, of course.
Sorry, I just got slightly lost in the timescale then.
Jumping ahead to January 2021 and the second set of school closures, there's some evidence that more vulnerable children attended school during that period. I'm conscious that you left your office in February 2021. Yes. Had you, though, been able to make any assessment?
Understood. Yeah. So I think there's a number of factors. Partly the population had slightly got used to the pandemic, and children had started to go back to school and had in large, a successful September school term. The majority of children went back to school and I think enjoyed being there, and had done so successfully. Also, parents had had many months where children had been at home, and for a lot of families that was quite a stressful time. And for those families that were working hard on homeschooling, they would all tell you how difficult that could often be in part. And they knew that children had often really experienced very negative responses to the isolation and being away from their friends. So most families knew that their children would benefit from being back in school. And there's another, with the families that are the most vulnerable often are the families who really needed to bring money into the household and needed to be able to work as well. So I think there's a whole range of combinations there which meant that more would likely attend at this point. I think in general, the population were much keener at that point and less fearful for their children to be able to attend, and so too for vulnerable families.
I'm going to turn then to ask you about the regulatory framework around children aside school, particularly during the first lockdown. I think it follows from everything you've said then that the most vulnerable children were at home during the first lockdown. Did you consider that there were, well, let me ask you an open question, what parts of the child protection framework were compensating for the fact that these children were at home and not in school during the period?
Well, again, the guidance asked local authorities to provide to ensure that their safeguarding responsibilities were delivered, and that they adequately protected children from harm. So there was a clear expectation that the responsibilities that local authorities would have would continue, and that it would be local authorities' responsibility still rather than central government. However, I was of the clear view that during a period of emergency such as this, then the most vulnerable children needed enhanced support, and there needed to be greater levels of contact, especially since that they weren't going into school, and that there needed to be face-to-face contact as well. That needed to be maintained as much as possible. So that was a view that I maintained throughout the whole period, that the greater the vulnerability, the greater interventions government needed to make at this time to ensure that those children were safe. And those were the arguments I made when the proposals in the Coronavirus Act around diluting regulations were made.
Can I just break that down a bit, please? So did you think that enhanced protection was required because, first of all, vulnerable children were at increased risk because they weren't at school?
Yes. And also they weren't in school, but they were locked down at home. Let's remember that people were only allowed to go out for an hour of exercise a day. Children, young people don't necessarily think of time out of home as exercise, but nonetheless. So it wasn't that they weren't in school. It was also that they were in a home environment, which for some children would have been in itself, would have had dangers within it. We know that referrals of domestic violence rose by 50% during those first few weeks. And as time went on, we also saw that the number of non-accidental injuries and instances of harm also increased by 27%. There was a group of children there were two groups of children that I was particularly concerned about: very young babies and teenagers.
I'm just going
we'll
to
come
because
to
I'm
that.
going to, and you've slightly jumped ahead, but as you've reached that point, let me ask you: were you sure yourself that the risk to children was actually crystallising into harm being done to children at greater levels during the lockdown?
Well, I
and
think
first set of school closures.
Yeah, I think it was very clear from the first few weeks that there were serious issues around domestic abuse. The police were reporting significant increases, and women's refuges were reporting 50% increases. And we know where there's domestic violence abuse in the home, its children will be involved in that as well. Again, we know that there were families living in very poor accommodation, often cramped, often sharing bedrooms with siblings, instances of some families sleeping on rota, the parents sleeping at certain points in the day, children sharing a bedroom at other points in the day. And the reports were coming in of increases in non-accidental injury, I think, by June. So that's slightly further on in the lockdown. But, you know, the instances of children living in a vulnerable household, that was where there was domestic violence and abuse already. That was where there was addiction already. And that was where there was serious mental health conditions. You know, that was a medical definition. So these were things that were going to become even more heightened whilst people were locked down together. And there was actually, when I looked at babies, particularly around vulnerability with babies, 45,000 children under 1 were living in households with poor mental health. And there were also, significant numbers living in households with domestic abuse as well.
Yes, I have those figures when we come to small children and babies.
Thank you.
And were you also concerned then that there would be children who hadn't come to the attention of social services, for example, because they hadn't reached a threshold, but who might be at more risk during the pandemic as well?
Yes, I mean, when we looked at those, the 829,000 children living in families, which I had already established, in my view, were invisible to the authorities, they were the ones which would remain invisible, but were also carrying the risks of harm during lockdown. And those numbers are backed up in data before the pandemic and after the pandemic. For instance, those children who enter the youth justice system, only 1 in 6 of those have been in touch with the authorities before. So, this wasn't the evidence we were putting forward was being upheld every time anyone came into contact with a child again. Those that were being referred to children's services because of concerns about child criminal exploitation, again, very low numbers. The ones that were referred were, in my view, the tip of the iceberg.
I'm going to move on then to some of the aspects of the regulatory regime that changed during the pandemic. I think that one of the first changes that was introduced was via the Adoption and Children Coronavirus Amendment Regulations 2020. Is that correct?
Yes.
And I think that it's right that they came into force, I think it was around the 17th of April 2020, is
Yes.
that correct? And that you were emailed about them on the 16th of April, is that?
Yes, there'd been a short conversation with someone in my team from an official the day before, I think, but it was very much about informing.
All right. And I think these were regulations that were made without the requirement that 21 days pass
Yes.
during which they're laid down before they take effect.
They were quite rushed.
And in terms of the email that your office received on the 16th of April 2020, how did it describe those regulations?
It described them as necessary to ensure that the system around children was able to function during a period of the emergency, specifically looking around concerns around staff absence because of sickness. So it looked at how those requirements could be relaxed during that period.
I think this, obviously, we're not trying to test your memory. I think
Yeah.
you've said out of paragraph 131 of your statement that your office received an email that referred to them as being minor changes. Is that right?
It said minor changes, and that was also reflected in the impact assessment that they undertook. It was said to be minor changes that were of a temporary nature.
And had you been consulted about these changes, or had they been even mentioned to you
No, they
prior
hadn't.
to the 16th of April?
No, they haven't.
And in terms of your overall assessment as to whether or not these were minor changes, first of all, it may be that this is too broad a question, but did those regulations make changes to a number of pieces of legislation that provided for certain standards of care or requirements across children's social care?
Yes, there were 24 different changes which led to practice changes in terms of support for these very vulnerable children. And we actually produced a framework document which described what this meant in practice, because we're very aware that, you know, if ministers were looking at something and describing it in legal terms, it's not always clear what that will mean in practice. So we produced a document that just listed what would happen in practice. I mean, it's fair to say of the, clearly this was a pandemic, things were moving fast. There were lots of things which you wouldn't have considered before and that were of great concern throughout. But this was a moment where I was horrified that these changes were being proposed because my starting point had always been that actually these children need additional help at this time rather than less.
So I think you've set out, and I won't take you through it in your statement, the reasons why you didn't consider those changes to be minor. And the inquiry is obviously aware that there's been litigation about those changes as well, or this legislation, and that it was regarded as unlawful because of failure to consult with you. But can I just ask you, had other parties been consulted about these regulations before the 16th of April?
It became apparent, I wasn't aware of this, but it became apparent that there had been some discussion, whether that was fully fledged consultation. It was described as consultation, largely with local authorities and largely around the flexibilities required to be able to function, which of course is important. But what there hadn't been is any prior discussion with children's rights organisations, or indeed with myself being the statutory person within that role.
And was an explanation offered as to why they had been consulted but not you about these changes?
There was no attempt at explanation really, other than we have to make sure that local authorities are able to deliver, which meant for me there hadn't been a consideration on the impact, or enough consideration on the impact on children.
And I think it's right that you regarded these changes as having made substantive changes to the standards of care provided to
That's
children.
right. These were wide-ranging. They diluted a whole range of different measures and activities. One very obvious one was around the ability to do more work through screens, and clearly there's a lot of difference from delivering such an intense function through a screen than there is through face-to-face, but also a whole range of issues around assessments, and again, EHCP plans, around timescales, around ability to operate, around the safeguards around sign-off for some of the decisions. They were put together. They had, in my view, a hugely detrimental impact on the safeguards and support for the very vulnerable children that needed the protection the most. I also felt they were quite unnecessary, because actually local authorities, even before, but continued to say that they weren't experiencing huge staff losses. In fact, in some of the answers I got back later on, I was told that it wasn't a problem because they didn't have staff shortages to the extent they thought they might.
I'll come back to what the justification for them in just a second. I just wanted to ask you a broader question, or I suppose a question about understanding. These changes had been framed as being minor. Did you draw any broader conclusions, or did you have any broader concerns about the understanding that there was about the sorts of changes that were being made?
Yeah, I mean, I think my conclusion was that there wasn't an understanding about the level of risk that some of these children were living with day in, day out. There wasn't an understanding of what that meant in practice in their lives. There wasn't an understanding of the vulnerability of their situation in many ways. And let's remember that babies are also part of this, and we know how vulnerable babies are when they rely on their carers completely. So in the run-up to this, I had been presenting what I believe is very highly credible evidence on the high levels of vulnerability that was unseen in families, and explaining what that meant in as practical a way as possible to ensure that people understood and were therefore able to respond to. But then when it got to this point, this, in my view, was a sweeping dilution of legislative protection at the absolute worst time for these vulnerable children.
And I think we're probably just about going to come to a break, but before we do, may I ask whether or not, in your view, that indicated a disconnect between an assessment made at a policy level or a government level and the sorts of insight, for example, that practitioners might have into the broader vulnerability of children?
I think it reflected a huge disconnect, but I also think it reflected an unwillingness to hear some of these things, because everyone who was working with those children, those families, was saying the same thing about those levels of vulnerability. The evidence that's been put forward was, in my view, very watertight. But also the level of resistance to these changes, and also the strength of the arguments being put forward was significant. So this was an intervention that I responded to over many conversations, over many letters. It was debated in Parliament. You know, there was a bank of evidence and view that this was the wrong thing to do, but it went ahead anyway.
I think what the government would now say is that those regulations weren't used very much. Do you have a view as to whether or not that...
I don't have the evidence to say they weren't used. I know they were used in many ways. I think that, again, was the expectation they would be a last resort, although that phrase wasn't used, it was implied. But actually, I think, you know, some of those became commonplace during that period of time. And use of screens is something that became the norm for some elements of child protection. We still see it. But I think they were used. I haven't the evidence that they weren't used. And certainly they were in place for several months. And indeed, originally it was intended that some would continue even for years.
Thank you, Melody. Is that a good point?
Certainly, just one question finishing on this point. It was the Department of Education, it was Secretary of State for Education who put these regulations.
It was.
Thank you.
And it was largely the children's minister within the department that I was talking to throughout this whole process and making the case that she should change her mind.
Very well, we take our break now. I shall return at past.
All rise.
Ms. Dobbie.
Thank you. Lydia Longfield, before we leave the topic of these regulations, can I just bring you back, please, to one of your contemporaneous documents? And that's INQ 000231402. If we could look at page 1, please. So I think it's correct. Is this a statement that you issued on the 30th of April 2020 about these regulations? Thank you. And if we go to page 2, does this set out all of the concerns that you had, substantive concerns, I should say, that you had about the changes that had been made by the regulations?
Yes, that's right. I mean, importantly, on page 1, I think I do recognise that we are in a pandemic and that people face a lot of challenges. And I felt it was important to say that up front. But listing there on the second page, I list out the range of changes and what would be required. So there's the issue around changes to social workers visiting children living in care, the review plans, children's homes, and the important issue of enforcing deprivation of liberty if they're showing symptoms of COVID, the independent panels.
Sorry to interrupt you.
Whole range of things.
Let me just stop you and see if we can deal with this quite quickly. But just looking through at the first bullet point. So this related to children living in care or who are privately adopted, and they should have been visited under the normal regime within 1 week when they've gone into care, and every 6 weeks after that. But that's been that was relaxed.
That's right. It then became, rather than the requirement, became reasonably practical. And it applies, as it said here, even if the visits are done by phone or video call. So clearly, if a child is vulnerable and at high risk, then visits, very regular visits, are very important to ensure and assess whether they're being cared for. And this reduce that significantly, and again, reasonably practical is something that is up for interpretation.
Lady Longford, sorry to interrupt. It's just I raised this issue during the break that I wanted more specifics about the criticisms you were making of the regulations. Now I have that summary, and apologies, I didn't realise it existed in the papers. And we don't need to go through it. I now have the detail of the criticisms that you make, so I'm very grateful.
No, thank you.
Forgive me, my lady, it is in the statement as well. So
it's my fault. I haven't been through it sufficiently.
Not at all, but I was going to just say on page 3, it might be important to highlight what you thought at the time, a concern that you had, and I'm just going to ask if we could bring up the first paragraph, please. That I think one of your concerns was that there was a different approach being applied here than was being applied to adult social care. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. And again, I was quite aware that the likelihood is that government wouldn't revoke the regulations. That's what I was asking for. And I wanted to see them being strengthened with guidance to make it clear that it would only ever be a last resort. And for a shortest period of time as possible, i.e. absolute emergency, which would have had an impact on how they were used, but that wasn't the case.
And I think that what you've actually set out here was similar protections must be introduced for children as those set out in adults when changes to the Care Act were introduced by the Coronavirus Act. This would mean that local authorities can only relax their adherence to duties if they can show that their workforce has been significantly depleted.
That's right.
So was that a distinction then that you?
Yes, it appeared to me children were being given less status and less priority, that their needs were being overlooked in this case, again, with some of the language about these being minor changes. And that there wasn't the requirement for any changes to be recorded and evidenced to the department or to Ofsted, and those all felt to be very necessary, really, to reinforce the message that this should be an absolute last resort rather than a slide towards normal practice during a difficult time.
In your evidence before the adjournment, you were explaining about changes being made so that children were seen remotely in some circumstances. The position, though, as regards the provision of general social work was different, I think. That was changed by way of guidance, is that correct? So in terms of social workers, the routine or the statutory visits that they would have?
Yes, but I think that this came as part of a package of relaxation, if you like. And of course, a lot of us moved on to remote working through screens. It became quite normal. But when you're making very important decisions about children's safety, you also need to talk to the child. And you need to be able to make any decisions informed by the whole context of the child's life, including the house, including food there, including cleanliness. And you have, therefore, to be there. And whilst, for most parents, this wouldn't be the case, there were some instances of some parents who took that opportunity to use and exploit that dilution of a way of keeping their child out of view.
I'm going to come to that. I'm going to just touch on the guidance, if I can, first, and your assessment as to it. And this is at INQ 000 519 580. So this is guidance that was published on the 3rd of April 2020. And if we could go, please, to page 3 and the paragraph under principles. So this set out local authorities and local safeguarding partners have specific duties under legislation and statutory guidance concerning support for families and the welfare and protection of children. We know that local authorities and local safeguarding partners will want to continue to meet their statutory duties as far as they can, but there will be times in current circumstances when this isn't possible. Did you understand from this guidance what regulations that was actually referring to at that point, or whether it was specific to any regulations, or did you think this was a general statement?
I took this to be a general statement. It was reflected in some of the language that was in some of the letters that I received from ministers, which made it clear that local authorities and their safeguarding partners would still be held responsible for their safeguarding responsibilities. The language there about local safeguarding partners will want to continue to meet their statutory duties. But then importantly, as far as they can, of course, as far as they can, within a relaxed framework, starts to open up all sorts of possibilities of what could happen in practice.
All right, and if we could just go then to page 5. And this was guidance, as we can see, about whether or not social workers should change how they visit children and families. And if we could just hone in on that, please. It sets out, we expect local authorities and social workers to make judgments about visiting, which balance, and it sets out the various risks. And then goes on to say social workers and their managers are best placed to make professional judgments of risk in each case. Did you think that was that a sensible approach, to provide a broad framework in those terms, and then to say it's a matter of local authorities to come to decisions based on discretion?
I mean, I would have preferred a much greater emphasis from central government about the absolute necessity for local authorities and social workers to continue their visits, to prioritise vulnerable children, and to ensure that they looked at alternatives, because one of the things within the impact assessment from the DFE was that it clearly said no alternative solutions were considered. So I think this showed a very blunt instrument. I think it slightly passed the buck in terms of responsibility. Of course, it was the local authority's responsibility, but, government is responsible for the welfare of children, and it allowed that to, I think, become much more of a potential local decision about balancing considerations. And let's remember that the social care system was pretty under a lot of pressure even before COVID. So we know that there's been pressure on the workforce, there's been pressure on recruitment. So it wasn't a highly resilient sector, if you like, already. So some of those decisions, which could have been made very locally, might have been made by those who didn't have huge of experience or didn't have the backup supervision to make them. There were lots of potential for things to go wrong with this, in my view, and ones that we shouldn't have tolerated, given the vulnerability of children and the seriousness of the pandemic.
If we just look at the paragraph below, it says social workers and their managers are best placed. Sorry, it's the paragraph below that again. It says, we recognise that there are circumstances where it will be necessary for social workers and other staff to visit children in person. Where face-to-face work is deemed necessary, practitioners should take account of Public Health England. Did you read that or interpret that as an assumption that visits would be remote unless it was necessary to see the child?
I think it puts the emphasis on the exception with visits. Now, I mean, I'd want to say there was fantastic work going on with social workers, so this is in no way a criticism, and they delivered brilliant support. But I think this is too loose, and I think it should have started with the expectation is that face-to-face visits take place. It may, on occasions, have to be through a screen, but I think it gets the wrong emphasis, and therefore, not ensure that the level of scrutiny is absolutely delivered.
in the next paragraph, it says, it has the heading, do children's social care staff need to use personal protective equipment for coronavirus? And then it sets out, where social workers and other staff are undertaking home visits, PPE is not required unless the people visited are symptomatic of COVID-19 or have a confirmed diagnosis of COVID-19. Where COVID-19 is suspected or confirmed, those undertaking the visit should use PPE. Was that useful guidance to social workers?
I mean, I maintain throughout that we should prioritise our social work staff and indeed our teachers for PPE, actually, to ensure that they have the confidence they need. So if it was a lack of PPE that meant that decisions were made not to visit children at home, then clearly there was something that needed to be done to ensure they had the confidence to do so. And if PPE was that, then that should have been part of that action plan.
And how were some social work visits are not with notice, are they?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Some social work visits take place without notice, don't they?
Yes, they will.
And sorry to cut across you.
No.
In what circumstances are they normally done without notice?
Well, they might be done if there was a particular concern about the immediate welfare of a child, for instance, but that would have to be a face-to-face visit in any case. So I would have been very surprised if that hadn't have taken place.
And how would a social worker know then in those circumstances that people had symptoms of COVID-19?
Well, of course, no, you wouldn't. And of course, that was fast changing as well. And again, whilst this was by no means many families, there were some families where they would exploit that for to ensure that they didn't get a visit from a social worker if they were looking to stay out of the limelight.
All right, so can I just ask you this then, standing back from guidance and what you understand to have taken place on the ground, were you concerned that the changes that were made to social work and the use of remote visits were having an impact on children's protection?
Yes, completely. I think what we saw was that many of the safeguards and processes that were there to ensure that children got the best possible support they could, including where they were placed, including some of their timings for their assessments and the like, were taken away. We saw that screens came into much greater use during that time. And this was against a period as well where non-accidental harm was also increasing. Now, whilst some of the serious case reviews from some of the more some of the tragic cases where children died during that period don't put all the blame down to these regulations or the pandemic by any means. They say quite clearly that there were systemic changes, systemic issues and problems in the social care system long before the pandemic. They nearly all say that the pandemic and the practice during the pandemic exacerbated some of those problems in the system and contributed.
I'm going to come to some of the specifics of that just very shortly. You point out in this, in your evidence, that there was a 31% drop in referrals made by schools in England or children's social care between pre-COVID, so 2019 to 2020 and 2021, during the period of the two lockdowns. In your view, does that reflect that less children were coming to attention because there was less harm, or is there another explanation for that?
Oh, absolutely, that there wasn't less harm. I mean, all the indicators were that harm was increasing, the figures I talked around with domestic abuse and the like. But the oversight wasn't there, the protective factor of school wasn't there. These, the instances and cases weren't being picked up. It's what, a lot of people warned would happen. And it was clear to see that they dropped off almost entirely at various parts of the lockdown.
So, in other words, comfort should not be taken from those statistics.
No, I think there was a hopeful aspect of some with some, and I'm not saying within government necessarily here, that actually, children aren't being referred, so maybe it's all okay. But actually, what all of those that were coming into contact with children, let's remember, lots of teachers and staff in schools were going out and meeting families. They all expected a huge surge in referrals once children came back into school, and it took a little time, but it did happen.
You mean in terms of referrals did recover at points during the pandemic?
Yes, that the harm was not visible because children weren't in places that others could see it, but that it remained. I would argue it was heightened, and when children did come back into school, then a lot of those referrals did take place. Actually, the referrals to mental health support did increase during this period, and we find that mental health charities mental health support, which was already struggling before the pandemic, continue to buckle under the level of demand for help.
In your statement, you go on to set out, and this is at paragraph 142 if you need the reference, the increases, for example, in children in need from 2018 to 2024, so bringing the position right up to date. Mm-hmm. Increases in the number of looked after children as well, up to 2024, and the number of children in secure homes and children's homes having increased as well, I think by 31%. Is that correct?
That's right. The statistics, the data that we produced in the summer is completely conclusive on the increase in virtually every indicator of vulnerability that we found from pre-COVID to today. And without blasting you with statistics, you'll have heard poverty now at 4.5 million, but just to say a few, just to give the impression of how much this has gone up. Persistent absence from school doubled, severe absence from school trebled, suspensions up 18%, alternative provision 82%, elective home education 80%, special educationally 34%, in-care 11%. Those with education and healthcare plans up 90%, autism referrals up 300%, mental health now twice as prevalent than 2017, and 50% increase in children who have been referred to social services because of child criminal exploitation. I say all of those because when you see all of these put together, there is clearly something going on. These are all going in the wrong direction. There are lots of areas of policy now which are seeking to meet these needs, but they're of such a scale that it's a major, it's a major barrier to reform because there are so many children now that need help.
And you may not be surprised that I'm going to ask you this, but do you see a line from the pandemic through to those statistics?
Yes, if you look at any one of them, and I've not got the graphs here for you, but if you look at any one of them, you will see the graph shoot up either during or just past the pandemic. So, for instance, mental health was at 1 in 10 children and with a suspected mental health condition. So this is quite a bar in itself to get to in 2017. By 2020, it was 1 in 6, July that year. Now it's 1 in 5, and for older teenagers, 1 in 4 with a suspected mental health condition. And the support service around that obviously has huge stresses on it to respond. and was not responding well even before the pandemic. Only 20% of children were being seen within 4 weeks. But also, it was also a postcode lottery. A lot of this, if you dive into this data, you'll see that around the country, there's a patchwork of responses. Some areas respond very well. For the mental health, as an instance before the pandemic, overall 30%, in 30% of areas, the cases were closed before children got to the point of having any treatment. In one area, it was 48%. So, there's a lottery here for children, whether they, once they have a referral, quite how long it's going to take, but if they're going to get any help at all. Now, there are measures that have been put in place, mental health teams in schools, for instance, that will start to address that. But the fact of the matter remains, the longer children stayed out of school, and of course there was that moment where schools remained shut and pubs and restaurants and zoos and theme parks opened, the deeper the risk to their mental health well-being and indeed their education remained.
Thank you. Lady Longfield, may I just ask you, coming back to some of the figures on social care, which is a separate, I know it's a related issue to mental health, but a separate issue. And I don't wish to be simplistic about this in any way. But again, is there a line that can be drawn between the pandemic and the elevated figures to which you've referred in your witness statement?
Yes, completely. There wasn't just the risk of harm to children directly. And, remembering all of these children were at least risk of the virus itself. But the vast majority of children will come into care because of the adversities their families are facing. We know that many families faced huge financial pressures during the pandemic and beyond. We know that poverty rates were rising. We know that the time out of school and without support meant that for children who had special educational needs were often not getting the help they need, or indeed were able to go back to school as swiftly as they might. So in any one of these, including children's social care, 11% increase over that period of time, you'll see that rise following the pandemic. And of course, what it needs is a huge move towards intervening earlier, because the cost of crisis for children, but also for the economy, is huge, which is why everything must be about supporting children to thrive rather than leaving them to fall into crisis. Important, though, that's specialist support, and vital that specialist support is at that point.
Thank you. I just want to come back, if I may, to the serious case reviews that took place. I'm not going to go into any of the detail of those cases. I just wanted to ask you, please, about some of the findings. And I'll read it to you rather than asking you to go to a serious case review. But there was a safeguarding panel report into the cases of Arthur Labinia Hughes and Star Hobson.
I don't know if you can get close to the microphone. It's my hearing as I get older, and you have a soft voice.
I'm also slightly small, short, I should say, so I can't.
Every size
it doesn't quite. I might get a box to stand on, and that might help. Let me see if I'll try and keep my voice up. One of the findings that was referred to set this out, and this is in the safeguarding report. In response to the COVID-19 pandemic, the local authority put critical incident arrangements in place from March 2020. These were at an early stage of implementation in April 2020, when concerns about Arthur were notified to the MASH, so the Multi-Agency Safeguarding Hub. Children's Social Care made a number of important adaptations for COVID-safe practice. Whilst responsiveness to referrals was maintained, the impact of these modifications led to fragmented management oversight of the response to individual referrals and a lack of clarity about case holding accountability. These aspects had some impact on the effectiveness of the response to concerns. And it goes on to talk about concerns about Arthur that I won't read out. Could you help the inquiry to understand a bit more about what that actually means in real life terms and what the fragmentation is that was being referred to there.
Well, as I said, often, there was social care teams were absolutely stretched to their sinews. They were huge pressures in terms of recruitment. Sometimes there were young, inexperienced social workers who were carrying loads and cases that were more complicated than they should. Sometimes because of pressures, there wouldn't be the supervision. And it was generally described by the person who led a national review on children's social care being a tower of Jenga held together by sellotape. So it wasn't a good place, if you like, before in many ways. And those systemic gaps would have been there beforehand. But then what happened with COVID and the dilution of regulations would have exacerbated some of this was, of course, there wasn't always a clarity about which families would be visited direct or not. There was change in practice in that. Some of it, as I've said, was through screens. And, families, if they wanted to, could quite quickly see how they could hold the interview in a very tidy, clean room, and the rest of the house might not be the same. The fridge might be full, especially. They wouldn't have been often there wouldn't have been an opportunity to talk to the child without the parent being there. There wouldn't have been access to the family members, and the family members wouldn't have had a closer route in. So if a family was raising concerns, that might have not been as possible to do. And then there was this sense that, actually it was an emergency. Everything couldn't be done. There were limits to what could be done potentially. I mean, social workers and social work teams did amazing things during this period, but the framework they were operating in was stretched before and remained stretched. I would have liked additional resources and support to be put into those social work teams during the pandemic to enable them to get more resources. I'd like to be looked at more creatively at how we could bring in potentially retired social workers and leaders within the team. There was a whole range of different ways that we could go around ensuring that support remained at the levels needed, rather than just leave it to the discussion and discretion of local teams.
I think you mentioned a little while ago that there weren't the level of vacancies in social services that perhaps were expected, although I'm sure that picture must have been
There weren't the
improving.
staff shortages, so
Right.
It was an expectation. I think probably most public services got a notification that they should plan for levels of absence that, from memory, I'm thinking 40%. I may be slightly wrong on that, but that clearly is a big dent in your workforce. And I imagine that the decisions originally were around some of those things. It became clear that in most areas there weren't those levels of absence from work, and there weren't gaps in the social work teams to that extent.
So your suggestion of more creativity being needed in a really practical sense in bringing in retired social workers, are you saying that it's experience that would help in these circumstances rather than manpower, or is it?
Well, both, of course, but clearly your most experienced staff are going to be even more vital during emergency. So to have more people on hand who can actually help make those strategic discussions and decisions and offer that guidance would have been really valuable. I guess for me, it comes down to, do you try and make good of a difficult situation by diluting things, or do you try and make good by actually enhancing the investment, effort, resources in there? And I've said many times over the last 5 years that there wasn't the kind of Nightingale moment that hospitals got in schools. So many things could have been done differently around keeping schools open, and they weren't. Similarly, with children's social care, moved straight to an outcome which was about diluting responsibilities, whereas actually there could have been that creative effort within within safeguards and the framework needed to ensure that children not only didn't get less support, they actually got more.
I'm going to touch very briefly on another area that changed, about which I think you had concerns, and that was the change that was made to education, health and care plans for those children with those elevated needs, as we've said. That duty changed from an absolute duty under Section 42 to a duty of reasonable endeavours. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
And
sorry.
I was just going to ask, that was also of concern to you, and I think a change that you also questioned whether or not it was necessary. Is that correct?
Yes, I mean the bar to get educational health plan is high. If children are at the point of needing a plan, they and their parents have probably been trying to get support for an awful long time. The range of support available outside that plan at the time was relatively limited. So it left very vulnerable children exposed without the help they need. And that meant that those that were going through that process didn't have any kind of assurity that they would receive the plan that they needed, but also those that needed to be referred and assessed weren't going to get the help they needed.
I think we'll see. I don't think I need to take you to this correspondence. I think I can take a shortcut to this point. You did write to the Children's Minister about these changes that had been made, and you may recall this. She wrote back to say that the problem was that children who were subject to these plans weren't in school, and that made it therefore difficult to provide
that their needs couldn't be met anyway. I think
yes.
was kind of the wording.
Did you have concern that was the rationale?
I mean, at that point, I thought we were in a bit of a doom loop of fatalism. We can't help children because we can't get them. They're not going to be in school. They're not in school because we haven't helped them get there. So, all of those things would have been possible with the determination to make it happen. It's that determination and will that I think was missing, along with that creative energy needed to make this a priority. But it seemed that the solution that was put forward was a kind of administrative solution that didn't have the ambition needed for those children, nor did it reflect the clear evidence of the vulnerability of those children in their context.
I'm going to move to a completely different point, if I may, Lady Longfield. One of the issues that you raised throughout the pandemic, and it's well documented in the evidence that the inquiry has, is your concerns about where children's interests fitted into the decision-making. And I think you reached a point, didn't you, where you wrote to Professor Vallance, or Sir Vallance, I think he is now, and to Professor Sir Chris Whitty as well, setting out your concerns. I'm going to jump to that, if I may, and that's at INQ 000 588 094.
Okay, we're in June now.
Yes. So I think we can see that before this point you had raised questions about where children fitted in. And I think if we just scroll, please, through this letter, you set out, and it's the third paragraph, despite this, and you set out a number of steps that were affecting children, so the closure of schools,
that's
closure
right.
of sports and summer play, closure of youth clubs, isolation of children for 7 to 14 days when they arrived at a children's home, children in hospital, youth custody, children's home, and foster care being denied visits, and then the confinement of children in their cells for over 20 hours a day. And I think if we can scroll down, please, thank you, and carry on. You say to Sir Patrick Vallance that you appreciated that these weren't his decisions, but that you understood, in effect, that they were being informed by scientific advice, correct? And then you set out 3 questions that you wanted to, you were asking about what consideration SAGE gave to children whenever it it
Yeah.
arrived at the advice that it was providing. Is that correct?
That's right.
And if we could go to the reply, please, at INQ 000239696. And you have a reply. In fact, it's from Professor Sir Chris Whitty and Sir Patrick
Yeah.
Vallance, where they
Very swift reply, actually.
Yes, from two very busy people. So if we just scroll down that, we can see, first of all, they set out in the first paragraph, they explained that there was a children's task and finish work
Yeah.
group. So in other words, there was a group of individuals who were providing advice that
right.
was specific to children. And then in relation to your first question, they explained that SAGE had considered the difference between adults and children and had given some recent advice.
That's right.
But I think saying the position wasn't quite so clear when it came to transmission about children between 14 and 18.
Yeah.
And then if we could just scroll down, I think explaining the fact that when it came to schools, there are issues around schools as well that make the issue of transmission slightly more complex, correct?
Yeah.
And then if we could carry on, please. It says whether SAGE has explored the potential for different social distancing requirements for adults and children. And it set out, I think, in summary, no, that hadn't been given
That's
consideration, that they had considered families as a group
Yeah.
rather than children specifically.
Yeah.
And then whether or not they were recommending that children were treated in the same way.
Yeah.
But I think they go on to explain that in schools they just assumed that social distancing wouldn't be in place, correct?
Yeah. Yeah.
So can I ask you some questions about that?
course.
You were worried that children weren't being given adequate consideration in the decision-making
Yeah.
process. SAGE is effectively a body of scientific advisors who provide advice to government. Did you come to any conclusion as to whether or not the concerns you had, which were the societal concerns, whether that was actually for SAGE, or whether or not these were considerations that fitted into another part of the decision-making process?
Well, it was clear to me that they hadn't been asked to do this by government, because I think if they'd have been asked to look at this question, they would have responded. And it was me asking the question, and the answer clearly, as you say, is no, we haven't done that. If you remember, the decisions were made. There was lots of comments on following the evidence. It was clear that, as you say, with younger children, there was less likely of infection or transmission. So for me, that was an argument why primary schools should open much earlier in this country, which is something they did in many European countries way back into April, beginning of May. But I think this fits in with a wider aspect of government's response, which is the attitude and priority given to children, or the attitude to looking at issues which impacted on children, really started from a starting point of what do we do for adults? So you saw it in the criminal justice system, you see it in terms of social distancing, in many different aspects. It was let's decide what we do about social distancing for people, and what the practice is, and then let's not look at anything different for children. And when we looked at children who were in custody, they were being kept in their rooms for 22, 23 hours a day, even though the likelihood of infection was much lower. With this, clearly it hadn't been something which had been looked at. And this, for me, had a direct relevance in September when the rule of six came about.
And I think that's at a point where you were calling for children to be exempted from the rule of six. Is that correct?
Yes, these are children who'd been isolated, cooped up at home for many, many months. We knew that their emotional, mental health was suffering, as well as their wider health. They weren't outdoors playing. And whilst there'd been an hour for exercise, as I said before, children don't generally exercise for an hour. They play with each other. So other countries, Scotland and Wales, exempt children under 12 from that rule of six, partly to allow them to go out to play with each other, partly so they could see, wider groups of their families, grandparents and the like. And that would seem to be a no-cost, very empathetic response, which would really give children a bit of a break, if you like, in every sense. And it was seen as too difficult. The decision was made not to do this in this country, so children were restricted for a much longer period of time.
Okay, so you did think there was greater scope for the government to seek more scientific advice about children?
I think there should have been, as part of. I mean, clearly, I'm saying that I don't think there was an adequate plan to support children or for children during the COVID pandemic. And as part of that plan, not only would you have the good data, you would also make sure that you looked at every different lever you could to bring about an enhanced situation for kids. And that would have been one where you'd have relaxed those requirements and at low health risks and very low costs, if any at all, allow children to socialise with their friends, get contact, get some exercise and start to rebuild what had been a very difficult few months.
I'm just focusing at the minute just on the structures for decision making. And SAGE provides scientific advice. You were concerned about broader societal consequences for children, exposure to abuse, effects on their education. So those have to be weighed in the decision making.
Of course.
I think you're saying somewhere. Where within government were you satisfied that voice or those considerations were being articulated by someone or some part of government when the most significant decisions were being made?
No, I wasn't. I felt that there wasn't anyone at senior level that took responsibility for for measuring and assessing those impacts. There was no one in the decision-making quad or in the cabinet table that were looking particularly at children's best interests. The nearest was the Education Secretary, I believe, wasn't involved in many of these decisions. So children had no voice within it, which is what I believe led to a series of confused responses to children's needs. But also, whilst they on occasion seemed to come into view, on many occasions they weren't and came behind in the queue to pubs, shops, theme parks, but also adults throughout.
Do you accept that, for example, within the Department for Education, there are many senior officials with expertise in children's lives and how schools work, the sorts of risks to children that you would be familiar with?
Yes, I think that within the department there are officials with access to good data, with responsibilities around some of those aspects, but they was often not seen to be the political will or agency to be able to make these decisions. I talked in my submission about a time where there was an impasse in schools opening where the department said that they weren't allowed to open because Public Health England wouldn't let them. And when I spoke directly to the CEO of Public Health England, he was aghast that this might be the case and described a set of guidance which provided a framework but enabled individual departments to make that decision. So I ended up with a brokerage role to bring those two together to come to a better place, but also to introduce some urgency and momentum behind it. But I think it's very clear that throughout the process that mistakes were made, children were overlooked, and there were mistakes and decisions that went against children's best interests.
I want to just come to a linked issue, please, and this goes to paragraph 20D of your statement, and it refers to a point in time, I think, when you called for government and unions to stop squabbling about the reopening of schools. Can you just explain what your concern was as to who was squabbling and what the impediment was at that point in time to these decisions being made?
It comes on the back of the conversation at the same time with Public Health England about who was telling who that things couldn't happen. And my worry was that there was an impasse and that there wasn't a momentum from government to break that impasse. There was the potential to have more socialising, more social activity in the community. So the decision then could have been that schools could reopen from the beginning of June. But instead, they remain closed. And as I said, other elements and other sectors happened. Bizarrely, that children were often with their parents in some of those shopping trips, but nonetheless, they weren't in schools. But the impasse was allowed to happen. In my view, unions were, and local authorities were working hard to get solutions, and I was working alongside several of the union leaders in this. There wasn't a good, trusted relationship, I don't think, with government or from either side, and I think that came from some cases way before the pandemic. But in my view, it was government's responsibility to break through that impasse and to find a solution that meant that children can return to school as swiftly as possible, schools being the last to close and the first to open was the mantra throughout. And the Prime Minister at that point had started with, to talk about that mantra too, but it wasn't followed through with action. So in my view, there were things that could have been done differently about the physicality of the buildings, which could have made it safe for children and for staff. There were things that could have been done about some of the timing, about PPE, about vaccinations as we moved on, that would have really reassured, but ensured, importantly at the end of the day, that children were able to get out of the lockdown and into the school environment. I don't think that that leadership or determination was in place.
I'm just going to touch again, this is coming to the end of the sort of decision-making framework. In your view and from your experience at the time, is the vehicle of an equality impact assessment adequate for taking children's rights into consideration when it comes to significant decisions?
Well, clearly it was, it was completed and has its role, but it wasn't enough to mitigate the avoidable mistakes that were made. Children's right impact assessment are crucial, and in Wales and in Scotland we saw much more prevalence of their usage, as indeed you saw much greater engagement, especially in Wales, with the Children's Commissioner, a much more collaborative approach. But if there had have been a thorough children's right impact assessment across all of the aspects of the strategy, which in my view was lacking but should have been there for children and for vulnerable children within that across the pandemic, then that would have been an ability to be able to consider those vulnerable children, to ensure that the impacts were proportionate, and ensuring that the measures were put into place didn't put any children at greater risk than they were, and in fact that those risks were ameliorated. That was a huge gap in the machinery of government that should have been there, and in my view should be there in the future. But although they were occasional impact assessments, they didn't have the status or the depth, or weren't given the importance by ministers and government leaders that would mean that they would have the teeth to ensure that the resources followed.
almost coming full circle, whenever the second decision or the announcement was made on the 4th of January in England that schools would again close to most children, had you been consulted about that decision prior to it being made?
Well, I think that was all very rushed and chaotic. So there was very little time for any consultation, because I think decisions were being made at the very last minute for that. No, there hadn't been a consultation. I'd been very clear that I thought that there'd been broadly success in children returning to school over the September months. Children were benefiting from that and recovering, even though they didn't have the kind of resources in the recovery programme that I really sincerely they believed. But that had gone relatively smoothly. When it got to January and the close, I thought that was avoidable with better planning. The Institute for Government were clear that one of the biggest mistakes that government had was that they didn't use that period over the summer to prepare for a future lockdown. They didn't do that in any way. Online education was slightly more developed because there'd been some lessons learned during the first half. But for most parents, they were aghast that their children would yet again be out of school, and most stayed out of school for those 2 months. So I wasn't consulted. I put forward alternatives, roadmaps and the like, and asked the Prime Minister to take a lead in making sure that children's best interests were taken into account. But at that point, I think that, it was a very reactive situation, and government was making decisions very swiftly on the hoof.
My lady, there was one question from a core participant.
Well, we're running out of time, I'm afraid. Mr. Dobbin, I've made it plain that we're very tight for time today. So I have to complete this witness's evidence by 10 to 1.
Yes. My lady, I will let the core participants then ask their questions.
Thank you. Ms Younger.
In Module 2, you gave evidence that you have had conversations with families suffering from long COVID, and you acknowledge that long COVID is, and I quote, very real, it's a reality for families and needs to be much more part of not only the debate, but also policy-making decisions. Why, Baroness Longfield, when you recognise the real impact of long COVID, did the Office of the Children's Commissioner, that's both you and your successor, take no steps to support or advocate for children and young people with long COVID?
Well, obviously, I can't speak for my successor in this, but I think from my point of view, I left the office at the end of February in 2021, which was around the time where I was becoming much more aware of the condition of long COVID. So I held a number of conversations with groups of families and young people themselves, and sought to include those discussions within the wider kind of advice I was giving about long term. But for me, that came towards the end of my term. So at that point, I was looking at ways that we could build back from COVID and learn the lessons from COVID. And this was the groups, although vital of importance, were just starting to gather their evidence at that point.
And a very quick follow-up, if I may, my lady. You said this morning that children were at least risk of the virus itself, but this is, of course, not correct, as you acknowledged in Module 2, for thousands of children and families in the UK for whom long COVID is very real, which were your words. Do you agree, and I think you do from the answer to question 1, that advocacy for the interests of a group of newly disabled children must evidently form a priority for the Office of the Children's Commissioner for England?
Well, the Children's Commissioner makes their own decisions about what they see as a priority. What I'd say in broader terms, then those children who are suffering from the impact of long COVID clearly have health needs and support needs that should be considered as a priority. And when we're looking at how we follow up, given the whole plethora of different groups that have increased in vulnerability. They need to be part of those groups, and they need to be a priority in policy making going forward.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Baroness, my lady.
Mr. Twomey, he's over that way. Can you see him? Lady
Yes,
Longfield?
hello.
Lady Longfield, on behalf of Article 39, your primary children's rights recommendation is for the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child to be fully made part of domestic law. What are the likely tangible benefits for children of the incorporation of the UN CRC in the event of another pandemic?
Yes, I mean, I think it's very important to have that certainty that the incorporation of UNCRC would bring to children's rights in this country. I think what we saw was that the pandemic was one of the biggest tests, if you like, to how prepared as a country we were for an emergency of this kind for children. And I think in many ways, we failed that. What incorporation would do and make it very clear that the commitment to children's rights was a core consideration, was a core element of our legal system in this country, then backed up by impact assessments that would make it absolutely crystal clear that we took these issues very seriously. It would mean that we'd be asking people to uphold a greater importance to children's rights, and it would be seen rightly as part of domestic law in this country.
I'm grateful. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Twomey. Mr. Broach, who's also over there.
Thank you, Lady. Lady Longfield, I had 3 questions to ask, but 2 have been asked and answered. I should only ask 1, Lady. So, Lady Longfield, from your experience of engaging with the UK government during the pandemic, how easy was it to find the relevant person to discuss issues concerning children outside of schools? For example, issues concerning children being allowed to play or safeguarding concerns?
Well, it was virtually impossible, and impossible before the pandemic, but also during it. There was no lead for anyone looking at issues around children's play. Clearly, if you're looking at specific health issues, then you know that there's a Secretary of State for Health. But no one in the round took responsibility for children's best interests. My view, and I've advocated this for some time, is that there should be representation at the cabinet table with a specific responsibility for children, someone that can advocate for children, not for the institutions around children, not for schools, not for hospitals and the like, but actually for children. And I think that, what that brings you to is a machinery of government that is ill-suited to the lives of children and makes it too easy for children to be overlooked. And there were avoidable mistakes that happened at the time. And I do believe that as a country that we and the Prime Minister should, at the end of this inquiry, and offer an apology to the children for the experience they had. And with that, a commitment that it should never happen again. And with that, a promise that children's rights and children's best interests be enshrined at the heart of our government and our society more generally.
Thank you, Lady Longfield. Thank you, my lady.
Thank you, Mr. Broach. And apologies to you, and apologies to Ms. Beattie. I took you out of turn.
Not at all.
I'm sorry. Right, back to Ms. Beattie. Ms. Beattie's there.
Thank you, my lady. Lady Longfield, I ask questions on behalf of National Disabled People's Organisations. You've covered with Ms Dobbin, KC, local authorities' very important safeguarding and child protection responsibilities and duties, and Ms Dobbin took you to the 3rd of April 2020 guidance for local authorities on children's social care. In your statement, you say that the guidance focused disproportionately on those responsibilities and that child protection role and did not provide adequate guidance on the minimum expectations in relation to local authorities' broader statutory duties to help and support children and their families where child in need plans are in place that might relate, for example, to a disabled child. Did the guidances focus on safeguarding and child protection to the exclusion of those broader duties? In your view, those broader duties which cover, help and support for children and their families create a risk that those broader duties of local authorities would be overlooked?
Well, I think they did. There was a risk with that, and I've already said that I thought that even within the safeguarding realm, that the guidance wasn't adequate. What was very clear to me throughout, and partly through discussions with families and young people themselves, was that the pandemic was very difficult for families with disabled children. A lot of the support that they would normally received suddenly disappeared. They would have had much more pressure in terms of their own situation at home. And I think that local authorities, given that they were already struggling to kind of meet the needs in terms of safeguarding, would have found it very difficult to meet some of those children and families' needs without additional resources. But I would say I think this was another occasion where it should have been anticipated, it should have been planned for, and additional help should have been put into place.
And it should have been covered more expressly in that guidance.
Absolutely more expressly in the guidance and in terms of the action taken.
My lady, I'm in your hands as to whether there is time just for the
Yes, you can-
very briefly the
We're
additional
doing
matter.
quite swiftly on this one, I think.
I'm grateful. In answer to Ms Dobbin, Lady Longfield, you made some comments on the factors relevant to what appeared to be higher attendance by vulnerable children in the second set of closures starting in January 2021, and you made some observations about that. And Ms Dobbin had previously asked you about the earlier bits of guidance in March, April 2020 and the requirement for education, children with education, health and care plans to undergo risk assessment.
Yeah.
When we come to that second set of closures in January 2021, the guidance no longer required that children with an education, health and care plan undergo risk assessment to be eligible to attend school. So my question is, did removal of that prerequisite also contribute to higher attendance in that later period of second closures?
So I don't have the data on that to hand. I would expect there would have been some increase in attendance, but I also know from conversation with parents at the time that there were particular worries for some disabled children about returning to school, particular levels of anxiety, and that for some families it was a slower process. So I would expect an increase, but I would also expect there would be a need for additional support for some families to be comfortable.
Thank you, my lady.
Thank you, Ms Beattie. And Ms Douglas.
Thank you, my lady. Thank you, Lady Longfield. I have two questions on behalf of CVF. CVF represents clinically vulnerable, clinically extremely vulnerable and severely immunocompromised children and their families. These children have underlying health conditions or other risk factors which place them at a higher risk of severe outcomes from COVID-19. Your witness statement doesn't mention the experience of clinically vulnerable children or children in clinically vulnerable families, or the impact of the pandemic on them. CVF have attempted to raise their issues of concerns with the Office of the Children's Commissioner, but have not received a substantive response. Would it be fair to say that these children were not a priority concern of the Office of the Children's Commissioner?
Well, again, I left that role in that office at the end of the 6-year term in February 2021, so I can't speak to anything that's happened since. It's the families were, of course, a priority, but we hadn't focused on those families as part of any of our areas of work. So they weren't part of our reporting in specific terms, but would have been more generally.
Thank you. My second question, my lady, is we appreciate that this was launched after your tenure as Children's Commissioner, but the Big Ask survey launched in March 2021, which aimed to capture the views of children mid-pandemic. It was cited as the largest ever study with 500,000 responses, and CVF encouraged its members to participate in that study. However, there were no questions included to determine household vulnerability, and as a result, the experiences of clinically vulnerable children and children in clinically vulnerable families were not accurately reflected in the findings. In broad terms, do you consider that this major national evidence gathering exercise as a result, overlooked one of the cohorts which were most affected by COVID-19 as a virus and most impacted by pandemic policies?
Well, I mean, I think it's very welcome that you encouraged your network to be part of that and other evidence gathering of this kind. Again, I can't speak to anything, any decisions in the Children's Commissioner's Office, including their surveys beyond that. But I think it's really important that the voices of the families and the experience of the children in your network are heard. And that's something that I think needs to be put to government, but also in more general advocacy. Yeah, there's an important case to be had and an important experience to be heard.
Thank you. Thank you, my lady.
Thank you very much, Ms Douglas. Well, after my sharp words, we finished before I had to finish. I apologise if I sounded too sharp. Thank you very much indeed for your help, Lady Longfield. You've given me a great deal of food for thought, as ever. And I will, of course, go through your written statement with great care. And I've been making a note of the recommendations.
Thank you.
So thank you very much for your help. And I was just thinking about one of them, the one about making somebody at cabinet level have responsibility. Looking at some of your reports, I mean, just off the top of my head, a number of government departments are immediately involved. You've got Justice, obviously, something which I've got an interest, Home Office, Department of Work and Pensions, whatever they call the Government Department for Local Authorities these days. They've all...
That's right.
Yeah, so you basically, you're sponsored by the Department of Education, or sorry, so you were.
Yeah, so the umbilical cord into government, the docking place for the Children's Commission is the Department for Education. Some of that as well is historic. Remember, the role was created when it was a Department for Children's Schools and Families, but it remained there, answerable to Parliament, and it is the Education Select Committee again. But if you ever get to the point where you have time to look at any of the letters, you'll see I'd write to the local government Secretary of State. It would be answered by someone over here because they would have responsibility for that aspect. And, you know, what families ultimately need near, you know, as part of their support near to home is people that are joined up, and it's the same at government level. So the answer was always, when it was asked, that the Secretary of State for Education was the person at the table that was responsible for children. But during the COVID pandemic, that person wasn't at the table of decision makers. So there is a disconnect there. And that's one of the avoidable mistakes I'm talking about. And I think that the machinery of government, you know, it's not... everyone's life, you know, all our lives don't fit neatly into a machinery of government, even within a mission-led government, which, of course, we're seeking to get. But for children in particular, they fall between so many different aspects. And if you take into account the fact that children so often, and I think the pandemic's shown it, were considered in a way that was almost secondary to adults. So it downgrades them again within departments. And there's just too many gaps and holes that open up. Whereas if what you really need is a strategy across government which is for vulnerable children, which is driven from the front, but from the middle as well, from the centre, and then different departments take their role. But someone advocating for children, I'm sure will have seen it in lots of people's submissions, and that's not to decry anything around the, you know, the arrangements we have, but when it comes to emergency and so many aspects of vulnerable children, they just don't work enough.
Thank you very much indeed, Lady Longfield. I'm really grateful, as I say. You remain a very passionate advocate for a very worthwhile cause. So thank you for your help. I shall return at 1:45.
All rise.